What he discovers is an ancient vault that hasn't been opened for over a century, and when he finally manages to unlock its heavy door, what's inside leaves him trembling and speechless. Jackson Reynolds had been working his family's fields in rural Nebraska for just over 8 months, but nothing could have prepared him for what his plow struck on that clear spring morning. The loud, metallic clang that resonated through his tractor cabin wasn't the usual sound of hitting a rock or remnant of old farm equipment. The vibration traveled up through the entire machine, strong enough to rattle the military dog tags he kept hanging from his rear-view mirror. Killing the engine, Jackson sat for a moment in the sudden silence, staring at the freshly turned soil behind him. 8 months of working this land, after inheriting it from his late uncle, had taught him to recognize the different sounds his equipment made. The dull thud of striking a buried stone, the sharp crack of hitting an old fence post, even the hollow echo of uncovering one of the drainage pipes his grandfather had installed decades ago. But this sound was different. It had an almost musical quality, like striking a massive bell buried beneath the earth. As he climbed down from his tractor, the warm Nebraska breeze rustled through the surrounding cornfields. It was mid-April, and he was preparing the eastern field for summer planting. Jackson's boots sank into the soft loam as he made his way to where his plow had struck the mysterious object. Kneeling in the dirt, he began brushing away loose soil with hands that still bore calluses from his military service rather than farm work. His fingers soon met something smooth and cold, too smooth to be natural. Scraping away more soil revealed what appeared to be a curved metal surface, its dark patina suggesting it had been buried for many years. The more dirt he cleared, the larger the metal structure appeared to be. This was no lost piece of farm equipment or forgotten machinery. This was something else entirely. Jackson's heart began racing as he expanded his search area. The metal surface continued in both directions, disappearing into the unplowed soil. Standing up, he could now make out a slight depression in his field, a barely noticeable dip that he'd driven over countless times without giving it a second thought. But now, with part of its secret exposed, he could see how the ground gently sloped in a perfect circle, approximately 15 feet in diameter. Using a shovel from his tractor, Jackson began to dig more systematically around the metal surface. After 20 minutes of careful excavation, he had uncovered what appeared to be the edge of a massive circular plate, like a giant manhole cover, but far larger and more elaborate. Around its circumference, he could make out strange markings, not quite letters, but definitely man-made symbols that had been carefully etched into the metal. The discovery filled him with equal parts excitement and unease. His uncle had owned this land for nearly 4 decades before passing it to Jackson in his will, and before that, it had been in the Reynolds family since the late 1800s, when his great-great-grandfather had homesteaded it after returning from the Civil War. They'd worked every inch of these fields, or so he'd thought. How had something this large remained hidden for so long? And more importantly, why was it here? As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across his partially excavated find, Jackson's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be some sort of old storm shelter, a forgotten water cistern, or something else entirely? The elaborate symbols around the edge suggested this wasn't just some utilitarian structure. Someone had taken great care in its construction and had clearly meant for it to remain hidden, Taking out his phone, Jackson tried to photograph the symbols, but the morning light cast awkward shadows that made them difficult to capture clearly. He'd need better equipment and probably more help to properly uncover whatever this was. Yet something made him hesitate before calling anyone. This was his land, his discovery. He wanted to understand what he'd found before word got out, and others started showing up with their own ideas about what should be done. Looking back at his tractor, Jackson knew he should continue with his day's work. The spring planting waited for no one, and he had acres left to plow. But the pull of this discovery was too strong to ignore. 8 months of struggling to adjust to civilian life after 3 tours in Afghanistan. 8 months of trying to learn, farming through online videos and occasional help from neighboring farmers. 8 months of wondering if inheriting this land had been a blessing or a curse. And now this mystery had literally emerged from the ground at his feet. Little did Jackson know that his decision to investigate further would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life forever, but would also unravel a century-old mystery that had been quietly resting beneath his family's farm all along. What lay beneath that metal surface would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family's history, and force him to question whether some secrets were better left buried in the past. The Reynolds family farm had once been the pride of Cottonwood County. Standing at the edge of his partially plowed field, Jackson could still picture how it looked in the photographs his uncle kept in the farmhouse. Rows of gleaming equipment, bustling farmhands, and silos full to bursting with grain. His grandfather, Thomas Reynolds, had been known throughout the county not just for his bumper crops, but for his innovative farming techniques that seemed to coax more yield from the soil than anyone thought possible. But those glory days were long gone now. At 34, Jackson found himself struggling to keep even a fraction of the farm's former acreage productive. The rusted equipment in his barn told the story better than words could. Repairs made with spare parts and baling wire, machines nursed along well past their retirement age because new ones were far beyond his means. The morning's discovery of the mysterious metal structure had interrupted his desperate attempt to prepare the east field for corn, a crop he couldn't even afford to plant without another high-interest loan from the bank. Walking back to his tractor, Jackson's boots left deep impressions in the soil as he passed the old oak tree where his grandfather had built a tire swing. The tree still stood, but the swing was long gone, much like many other pieces of his family's legacy. The drought 5 years ago had forced his uncle to sell off the southern parcels, land that had been in the Reynolds family since his great-great-grandfather, James Reynolds, had first homesteaded here in 1866 after serving in the Union Army. Inside the tractor's cabin, Jackson picked up the worn leather journal he'd found in the attic shortly after moving in. It had belonged to James, passed down through generations along with the farm itself. The pages were filled with detailed observations about the land, weather patterns, and farming techniques written in his great-great-grandfather's careful hand. But there was something else too, something Jackson had never quite understood. Scattered throughout the journal were cryptic references to what James called the sentinel below and the trust we are bound to keep. Jackson had always assumed these were just poetic ways of describing the soil itself, the foundation of any farmer's livelihood. But now, with that massive metal structure lying partially exposed in his field, those mysterious phrases took on a new significance. Could James have known about whatever lay buried in the earth? And if so, why hadn't that knowledge been passed down more explicitly through the generations? The financial pressure of recent months had left little time for family mysteries. The bank's latest letter lay crumpled in his pocket, a final notice that made it clear his options were running out. Modern farming was a game of scale, they told him. Small family operations like his were becoming increasingly unsustainable. The mega-farms were buying up all the struggling properties in the county, consolidating them into massive operations, run more like factories than traditional farms. Last month, Heartland Agricultural Enterprises had made what they called their final generous offer to buy him out. The figure would have cleared his debts with enough left over to move back to the city and start fresh. Many of his neighbors had already taken similar deals, their farm legacies absorbed into the corporate giant's ever-expanding holdings. The thought of being the first Reynolds to lose the farm entirely made his stomach churn. But the reality was that he was running out of options. His Purple Heart medal was pinned to the tractor's sun visor, a bittersweet reminder of the life he'd left behind. The transition from soldier to farmer had been far more difficult than he'd anticipated. The skills that had kept him alive in combat zones weren't particularly transferable to agriculture, and the peaceful isolation that had initially seemed like a perfect antidote to his PTSD often morphed into a loneliness that left him staring at the ceiling night after night, wondering if he'd made the right choice in accepting his uncle's bequest. The farm's decline hadn't happened overnight. Like erosion wearing away at riverbanks, it had been a gradual process. First came the rising costs of equipment and supplies. Then the droughts hit, forcing his uncle to invest heavily in irrigation systems just to maintain minimal yields. The loans piled up, each one carrying a higher interest rate than the last, as the farm's credit rating deteriorated. The final blow had been the collapse of corn prices 3 seasons ago, leaving the operation unable to even cover its operating costs. Looking out across his fields, Jackson could see the encroachment of Heartland's corporate operation on the horizon, their massive grain elevators rising like modern pyramids against the Nebraska sky. Their offers had become increasingly aggressive, and their representatives never failed to remind him that his situation would only get worse. The age of the family farm is over, they'd tell him, as if reciting a natural law as inevitable as gravity. The discovery of the mysterious metal structure had interrupted his morning routine of worry and resignation. For the first time since returning from his final tour, he felt something different, a spark of curiosity and possibility that pushed his financial concerns temporarily to the background. Whatever lay buried in his field had been there for generations, waiting. Perhaps it had been waiting specifically for him. Checking his watch, Jackson realized he'd spent over an hour contemplating his situation instead of continuing with his plowing. Time he couldn't really afford to waste. But as he reached for the tractor's ignition, his hand hesitated. The bank's deadlines and Heartland's pressures suddenly seemed less urgent compared to the mystery literally unearthed before him. He had a feeling that what lay beneath that metal surface might change everything for better or worse. Jackson sat in his tractor for several long moments, weighing his options. The practical part of his mind, the soldier's mindset that had been drilled into him during military service, urged him to continue with his plowing. The corn needed to be planted within the next 3 weeks if it had any chance of optimal yield. Every hour spent investigating this strange discovery was time taken away from the farm's already precarious operation. But there was another voice in his mind, growing stronger by the minute. It whispered of opportunity, of destiny, of mysteries that had waited generations to be uncovered. His eyes drifted back to his great-great-grandfather's journal, to those cryptic references he'd never fully understood. The coincidence seemed too perfect to ignore, finding this structure just when he was closest to losing everything. The training from his military days, especially his time in special operations, had taught him to trust his instincts. And right. Now every instinct told him that this discovery was important, perhaps even vital to his future and the future of the Reynolds farm. With a decisive motion, he shut off the tractor completely and pocketed the keys. The plowing could wait. This couldn't. Climbing down from the tractor again, Jackson walked back to the partially exposed metal surface. The midday sun had risen. Higher now, and the strange symbols carved around its edge seemed to shimmer with an almost ethereal quality. He traced one with his finger, feeling the precision of its carving. This was no crude marking. Whoever had created this had done so with great skill and purpose. Taking out his phone, Jackson hesitated before making a call. His first instinct was to contact Dr. Eleanor Wright, the local historian who'd written several books about the county's settlement. Eleanor would be fascinated by this discovery, but Jackson knew that calling her would mean opening the floodgates. Once word got out, his quiet family farm would become a circus of historians, archaeologists, and curiosity seekers. More importantly, it would certainly catch the attention of heartland agricultural enterprises, who would likely use any disruption to his farming operation as leverage to force a sale. There was also the matter of regulations. Jackson had heard enough stories about farmers finding historical artifacts on their land, only to have their operations shut down by preservation orders and archaeological surveys. He couldn't afford any delays or restrictions on his ability to work the land, not with his current financial situation. Yet the pull of the mystery was undeniable. Jackson found himself walking back to his barn, drawn by an idea that had been forming in his mind. During his second tour in Afghanistan, he'd been assigned to a unit that specialized in underground tunnel detection. Somewhere in his footlocker of military gear was a compact metal detector he'd purchased himself and used unofficially to sweep areas before his team entered. The military hadn't exactly sanctioned his additional precautions, but his commanding officer had looked the other way after the device helped them discover a hidden cache of explosives. After 15 minutes of searching through dusty boxes and equipment, Jackson found the device. It was small, but powerful, designed to detect metal through several feet of soil. The batteries were dead, but he managed to find replacements in his toolbox. When he switched it on, the device hummed to life, its digital display glowing brightly. In the dim light of the barn, returning to the field, Jackson began a systematic sweep around the exposed metal surface. The detector's signals painted a picture of something massive underground, far larger than what was visible. The circular plate he'd uncovered appeared to be just the top of a much more extensive structure. As he worked his way around the circumference, the reading suggested that whatever was buried extended at least 12 feet below the surface and encompassed an area nearly 30 feet in diameter. His mind raced with possibilities. The construction must have cost a fortune, even by today's standards. What could have motivated someone to build something so elaborate and then hide it so completely? And why here, on what was then just a remote homestead in the Nebraska territory? The responsible thing would be to report the finding, to bring in experts who could properly investigate while protecting any historical artifacts. But as Jackson stood there, the weight of his great-great-grandfather's journal in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. James had known about this place, had written about it in ways that suggested it was something to be protected, not exposed. Looking back at his farmhouse, Jackson thought about the bank's final notice and Hartland's predatory offers. Whatever lay beneath his feet had been deliberately hidden, and his family had been chosen as its guardians. Perhaps that wasn't an accident. The decision crystallized in his mind with surprising clarity. He would investigate this himself, at least initially. If he found something dangerous or of vital historical importance, he could always bring in the authorities later. But first, he needed to understand what his great-great-grandfather had considered important enough to bury and protect. Walking with renewed purpose to his truck, Jackson began loading tools he might need: shovels, work lights, his old climbing, rope from his days in the 10th Mountain Division, and a battery-powered angle grinder. He also grabbed his military-grade flashlight and the tactical camera he'd used for mission documentation. If he was going to document this, he wanted to do it in a way that couldn't be easily traced or shared without his permission. As he worked, Jackson formulated a plan. He would wait until dusk to begin the serious excavation. His field was invisible from the main road, and the neighboring farms were far enough away that no one would notice lights or activity after dark. He could use the remaining daylight hours to continue his regular farm work, maintaining appearances while preparing for what might be the most important night of his life. The decision felt both terrifying and right. For months, he'd been a passive participant in his farm's slow decline, watching helplessly as forces beyond his control stripped away his family's legacy piece by piece. But this discovery, whatever it might lead to, was something different. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he felt like he was taking control of his destiny. Checking his watch one last time, Jackson climbed back into his tractor. He would finish plowing the unaffected parts of his field, keeping to his normal routine. But as the machine rumbled to life, he felt a profound shift in his perspective. The day's farming tasks were no longer just about survival. They were cover for something far more important. Whether that something would prove to be his salvation or his undoing remained to be seen, but he was committed to finding out. As dusk settled over the Nebraska plains, Jackson parked his truck strategically to shield his work area from the main road. The spring air had grown cooler, and his breath formed small clouds in the beam of his headlamp. He'd spent the afternoon making preparations while trying to maintain an appearance of normality, even waving to Hartland's survey team as they drove past his property for their routine inspection of neighboring farms they'd recently acquired. The metal detector had revealed that the circular plate was approximately 15 feet in diameter, and what lay beneath seemed to extend at least 12 feet down. Jackson had mapped out the entire underground structure using a grid pattern, marking the boundaries with small flags he normally used to mark irrigation lines. The scale of what he'd discovered was both exciting and daunting. Starting at the edge where his plow had first struck metal, Jackson began carefully removing soil with a shovel. He'd learned from his military training that rushing excavation often caused more problems than it solved. Every few inches he would sweep away loose dirt with a brush, revealing more of the intricate symbols carved into the metal surface. The symbols themselves were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They weren't Native American in origin, at least. Not from any tribes he knew had lived in this region. They weren't military symbols either, despite his familiarity with a wide range of tactical and historical markings. The precision of the carvings suggested they'd been made with advanced tools, not crude instruments. After 3 hours of careful digging, Jackson had exposed about a third of the circular plate. The symbols formed concentric rings around what appeared to be a central mechanism, something that looked almost like a sophisticated lock. His great-great-grandfather's journal had mentioned the sentinel below multiple times, but nothing about how to access it. Taking out his tactical camera, Jackson methodically photographed each section of exposed symbols. The camera's specialized lens captured details his phone couldn't, revealing subtle variations in the depth and style of the etchings. As he reviewed each image on the camera's display, he carefully copied the symbols into a notebook, trying to detect any patterns or repetitions that might suggest a code or language. The central mechanism was particularly intriguing. It appeared to be made of a different metal than the rest of the plate, something that hadn't tarnished despite its years underground. In the beam of his headlamp, it almost seemed to glow. There were what looked like keyholes arranged in a circle, but they were unlike any keyholes he'd ever seen. Checking his great-great-grandfather's journal again, Jackson found a passage he'd never paid much attention to before. The key lies in the alignment of stars when first blood was shed on sacred ground. The words were followed by a series of numbers that he'd always assumed were crop yields or weather observations, but looking at them now, they seemed to correspond to the arrangement of symbols on the plate. Working methodically, Jackson began, cleaning the central mechanism with small brushes and compressed air from his workshop. Each component seemed to move slightly when pressed, like parts of an elaborate combination lock. The craftsmanship was incredible. Despite being buried for what must have been over a century, the mechanisms moved smoothly, without any sign of rust or deterioration. As midnight approached, Jackson had to make another decision. He'd exposed enough of the structure to attempt opening it, but doing so would be a point of no return. Once the seal was broken, there would be no hiding the fact that someone had discovered and accessed whatever lay below. Taking out his thermos of coffee, he sat on the edge of the excavation and reviewed his photographs. The symbols seemed to tell a story, one that spiraled inward toward the central lock. Some of the sequences repeated, like refrains in a piece of music. His great-great-grandfather's numbers might be the key to understanding their pattern. The sound of a distant vehicle caused him to quickly douse his lights. Headlights swept along the main road, then turned onto the dirt track that led to Heartland's grain storage facility just a mile from his property line. Just a night watchman making his rounds, but it was a reminder that he needed to be careful. Whatever he decided to do next would have to wait for another night. Carefully covering his work with tarps and loose hay, Jackson gathered his tools. He'd made significant progress, but more importantly, he'd confirmed that this was no random structure. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this vault and ensure it could only be opened by someone who understood its secrets. As he drove home in the dark, his mind was already planning the next steps. He would need to decode the symbol sequence, understand his great-great-grandfather's numbers, and figure out how the locking mechanism worked. But he also knew he needed to maintain his normal farming routine to avoid arousing suspicion. Heartland's people watched the county like hawks, always looking for signs that another family farm was failing. Tomorrow he would return to his regular farm work, But tonight, as he carefully stored the photos and his notes in the fireproof safe he'd brought from his military days, Jackson felt a growing certainty that he was on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary. Whether it would be enough to save his farm remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, he felt hope. The next few days tested Jackson's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each morning he would check the tarps covering his discovery, and each morning the sight of them filled him with a mixture of excitement and growing anxiety. The weather forecast predicted severe thunderstorms by the end of the week, a development that could severely complicate his covert excavation efforts. But weather wasn't his only concern. Word had somehow gotten out that Heartland Agricultural Enterprises was increasing their presence in the county. 5 more of his neighboring farms had sold out in the past 2 weeks alone, and the corporate giant surveyors seemed to be everywhere, their white trucks constantly patrolling the back roads as they assessed their newest acquisitions. On the 4th morning after his discovery, Jackson noticed fresh tire tracks leading partway into his field, stopping just short of the covered excavation site. Someone had been on his property during the night. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the spring air. He spent the next hour carefully checking his work area, but the tarps appeared undisturbed. Still, the incident forced him to add more camouflage and rethink his timeline. The symbols themselves were proving to be another source of frustration. Despite hours spent comparing them to his great-great-grandfather's journal entries, the pattern continued to elude him. The numbers James had written seemed to correspond to something, but every sequence Jackson tried with the central locking mechanism led nowhere. Each failed attempt left him wondering if he was damaging the delicate machinery. His former squadmate Marcus Chen called that evening. They tried to stay in touch monthly, checking in on each other's transition to civilian life. Marcus had gone into software engineering in Seattle, about as far from battlefields or farm fields as one could get. "How's the crop whispering going?" Marcus asked, his familiar teasing tone a welcome distraction from Jackson's current predicament. "About as well as you'd expect for a guy who couldn't keep a cactus alive in the barracks," Jackson replied carefully, steering the conversation away from anything that might hint at his discovery. As much as he trusted Marcus, this felt like something he needed to handle alone, at least for now. That night, as Jackson worked by lamplight at his kitchen table, surrounded by the photographs and his notes, a new worry began to gnaw at him. What if there was nothing valuable in the vault? What if all this effort, all this secrecy was for nothing? Or worse, what if he found something that would only bring more problems? His mind wandered to stories he'd heard about farmers finding Native American artifacts and losing their land to archaeological preservation orders, or to his time in Afghanistan, where the discovery of ancient sites sometimes led to unexpected complications for local communities. The next morning brought a new complication. His irrigation pump, already held together mostly by hope and duct tape, finally gave up the ghost. The timing couldn't have been worse. He needed to maintain appearances of normal farming operations, but he couldn't afford repairs right now. Every dollar he had was tied up in seed corn he still hadn't planted. As he stood in his barn, staring at the disabled pump, Jackson noticed something odd about the old metal toolbox he'd inherited along with the farm. He'd walked past it thousands of times, but now, with his mind attuned to patterns and symbols, he saw that the worn decorative scrollwork around its edges wasn't decorative at all. The marks were weathered almost to invisibility, but they matched some of the symbols on the vault. His hands trembling slightly, Jackson opened the toolbox. Most of its contents were familiar, the usual assortment of vintage tools and spare parts. But when he removed the upper tray, he found something tucked into a hidden compartment beneath. A small metal object, approximately 6 inches long, shaped like a cylinder with one flattened side. The entire surface was covered with symbols, matching those on the vault. The discovery should have been encouraging, but it only added to his anxiety. If this object was meant to help open the vault, why hadn't James left clearer instructions? And why hide it so carefully? The more Jackson uncovered, the more questions arose, and the weight of responsibility felt increasingly overwhelming. That afternoon, he received another letter from the bank. They were calling in his equipment loans early, citing missed payments and market uncertainty. Without functioning irrigation, he had no way to maintain even the appearance of normal operations. The walls were closing in, and time was running out. As dusk approached, Jackson stood at the edge of his field, the metal cylinder heavy in his pocket. The first clouds of the predicted storm system had begun to gather on the horizon, and thunder rumbled in the distance. He had a decision to make: wait for better conditions and risk losing everything to the bank, or push forward tonight despite the weather and increasing surveillance. The complexity of the vault's locking mechanism suggested that whatever lay within was meant to be protected at all costs. But protected from what or whom? For the first time, Jackson wondered if his great-great-grandfather's silence about the vault's existence had been meant as a warning rather than a challenge. The storm that hit the county that night was unlike anything Jackson had seen since. Moving back, sheets of rain turned his field into a muddy morass, and lightning split the sky with such frequency that he had to shut off his work lights to avoid drawing attention. But it wasn't the weather that would prove to be his biggest problem. As he struggled to protect the excavation site from flooding, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dude, just heard from my cousin who works at the county records office. Someone from Heartland was asking about Civil War veterans who settled in your area, specifically requesting info about James Reynolds. What's that about?" Jackson's hands shook as he read the message. Heartland's interest in his great-great-grandfather could only mean one thing. They somehow knew something was different about his property. The random surveying, the nighttime visitors, the increasing pressure from the bank. It all suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't just trying to buy his farm. They were looking for something specific. Working frantically in the rain, Jackson managed to rig a makeshift shelter over the vault's exposed surface, using tarps and lumber from his barn. But as he finished securing the last corner, his headlamp illuminated something that made his blood run cold. There, half buried in the mud, was a small electronic device, some kind of sensor or tracker that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Checking the perimeter of his property, Jackson discovered 2 more devices hidden in the tree line, near his field. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just being watched, he was being monitored professionally. His amateur attempts at secrecy had probably looked like neon signs to whoever was surveilling him. Returning to his house to change out of his soaked clothes, Jackson found his front door slightly ajar. He always locked it, the habit ingrained, from both his military days and his uncle's insistence on security. Heart pounding, he pushed it open slowly, automatically falling into the room-clearing techniques drilled into him during his service. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but years of tactical awareness had taught him to notice details others might miss. Little things were off. papers on his desk slightly reshuffled. His great-great-grandfather's journal moved a fraction of an inch from its usual spot. Someone had been inside, searching for something. Moving quickly, Jackson checked the fireproof safe where he'd been keeping the photos and his notes. The lock showed no signs of tampering, but when he opened it, he knew immediately that the contents had been photographed or scanned. The stack of photos was ever so slightly out of alignment, and one of his notebooks was bent at a different angle. His hands trembling, Jackson gathered everything related to the vault and stuffed it into his old mission rucksack. He couldn't leave any of it in the house now. But as he was about to close the safe, something caught his eye. A tiny piece of paper had fallen between the safe's wall and floor. Fishing it out, he found himself staring at a note written in his great-great-grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "If they find you, destroy everything and salt the earth. Some secrets must remain buried." The cryptic warning sent chills down Jackson's spine. For the first time, he wondered if his great-great-grandfather had hidden the vault not to preserve something valuable, but to protect the world from something dangerous. The symbols, the elaborate locking mechanism, the generations of secrecy. What if it had all been containment rather than conservation? Another crack of lightning illuminated his kitchen, and in that brief flash, Jackson saw a figure moving quickly past his window. Someone was out there watching his house. His phone buzzed again, another text from Marcus. "Jackson, seriously, man, call me. Just heard from my cousin again. 2 men in suits were asking about your land specifically. They had satellite images from last week. What's going on?" The walls were closing in. Jackson had thought he was being careful, but he'd underestimated what he was dealing with. Heartland Agricultural Enterprises wasn't just some corporate farm conglomerate. They had resources and capabilities far beyond what he'd imagined, and they'd been looking for the vault long before his plow had struck metal. As if to confirm his worst fears, he heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching on his access road, multiple vehicles by the sound of it. In that moment, Jackson realized he had only minutes to make a decision that would affect not just his future, but potentially much more. Whatever lay in that vault had been important enough for his great-great-grandfather to hide completely and protect with warnings written in code. Just as Jackson heard the vehicles pulling up to his property, his phone rang. Not Marcus this time, but Earl Blackburn, his elderly neighbor whose family had farmed the adjacent property since before. The Reynolds arrived in the county. Earl's voice was urgent, none of his usual casual drawl. "Reynolds, get to my place through the creek bed now. I'm looking at 3 black SUVs headed your way. Those aren't Heartland regular people." The creek bed. Jackson had almost forgotten about it. During the Dust Bowl, the farmers in the county had created hidden paths to help each other transport water from the few remaining sources. Most of the paths had been reclaimed by nature over the years, but the one connecting his property to Blackburn's had been maintained as an emergency route during flood seasons. Grabbing his rucksack and the metal cylinder, along with his great-great-grandfather's journal, Jackson slipped out his cellar door just as headlights swept across his front yard. The entrance to the creek bed path was hidden behind a thicket of wild raspberry bushes about 50 yards from his house. A secret Earl's father had shown Jackson's uncle years ago, just in case. The path was muddy and treacherous in the rain, with overhanging branches slapping against his face as he moved as quickly as he dared through the darkness. Behind him, he could hear muffled voices and the sound of car doors slamming. They would find the path eventually, It was just a question of how long it would take them. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, Jackson emerged through a similar thicket on Blackburn's property. Earl was waiting for him on his back porch, shotgun in hand, looking grimmer than Jackson had ever seen him. "They've been watching all of us," Earl said without preamble, "ever since they started buying up farms in the county. But you found something, didn't you? Something they've been looking for." Before Jackson could respond, Earl's wife Martha hurried onto the porch. "They're at the house," she said quietly. "4 men in suits. They're showing some kind of private security badges, asking about unusual structures or historic sites in the area." Earl's expression hardened. Badges can be faked, and even if they're real, that doesn't mean they're on the right side of this. He turned to Jackson. "Your great-great-grandfather James wasn't the only one who left warnings. My grandfather had notes about something hidden in the county, something important enough that people would come looking eventually." Moving quickly, Earl pulled out an old leather-bound ledger from behind a loose brick in his fireplace. "The families in this county, the original settlers, they chose this place for a reason. The farm sales, the surveys, the sudden interest in local history, it's all been building to this. Heartland isn't just buying land, they're searching for something specific." Jackson spread out his great-great-grandfather's journal and the photos of the vault symbols. Earl studied them intently, then began flipping through his ledger. "These markings, they're not just decorative. They're part of a larger pattern. Your great-great-grandfather was part of a group that hid something important, something they thought would be dangerous in the wrong hands. Each family was given part of the information needed to access it, but no one family had the complete key." Martha, who had been keeping watch at the front of the house, called to them quietly. "They're starting to search the outbuildings, and more vehicles are arriving." Earl's weathered hands moved quickly as he copied something from his ledger into Jackson's notebook. "This is our family's part of the sequence, combined with your symbols and the mechanism you found. It might be enough to open the vault. But Jackson, are you sure you want to? Our grandparents went to incredible lengths to keep this hidden." A sudden banging from the front of the house made them all jump. Voices could be heard in the Blackburn's front hall. "Mr. Blackburn? Security. Personnel, we need to speak with you immediately regarding neighboring property surveillance." Earl grabbed Jackson's arm. "There's another path, older one, leads to the old Chapman place. David Chapman's grandfather used to maintain it. If anyone would know more about what's hidden on your land, it would be him. David's the county historian now." Martha quickly gathered some supplies, flashlights, water, some food, and stuffed them into Jackson's rucksack. "The path entrance is behind the tool shed," she whispered. "Once you're in, follow the old fence posts. It's about 2 miles to the Chapman farm. And Jackson, be careful. Whatever's in that vault, there are clearly people willing to go to extreme lengths to find it." As Jackson prepared to leave, Earl pressed a small metal object into his hands, similar to the cylinder he'd found, but with different markings. "Family heirloom. Never knew what it was for, but the markings match your photos. Now go. We'll stall them as long as we can." The sound of footsteps approaching the back of the house spurred Jackson into action. As he slipped behind the tool shed and found the hidden path entrance, he could hear Earl's voice, loud and annoyed, confronting the security personnel about searching private property without a warrant. The old farmer was buying him time, but how much? The path to the Chapman farm was overgrown and difficult to follow in the darkness and pouring rain. Tangled underbrush and fallen trees blocked portions of the trail, forcing Jackson to rely on his military training to navigate the obstacles. The 2 metal cylinders felt heavy in his pockets as he pushed forward, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just learned. The original farming families had chosen this county deliberately, working together to protect something so important that its secrecy had been maintained across generations. After nearly 2 hours of difficult progress, soaked to the skin and covered in mud, Jackson finally reached the edge of the Chapman property. The farmhouse stood dark against the stormy sky, but a dim light glowed from a small outbuilding that Jackson recognized as David Chapman's private museum of local history. As a child, he'd visited once with his uncle during a county heritage day. Chapman had spent decades collecting artifacts and documents related to the area's settlement. Using his military training, Jackson approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of surveillance before making his way to the outbuilding door. A knock brought the silhouette of a thin, elderly man to the window. After a moment's hesitation, the door opened to reveal David Chapman, his eyes widening at the sight of Jackson's mud-covered appearance. "Reynolds' boy," he said quietly. "Earl called. Said you might be coming. Get in here before anyone sees you." Inside, the single room was lined with display cases and filing cabinets, each meticulously labeled and organized. Maps and photographs covered the walls, creating a comprehensive visual history of the county. "You found it, didn't you?" Chapman asked without preamble, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Sentinel Vault. They've been looking for it for decades." "They?" Jackson asked, removing the 2 metal cylinders from his pockets and placing them on Chapman's desk. The old historian's hands trembled as he picked up the cylinders. Heartland is just the latest face. Before them, it was Midwest Consolidated Resources, and before that, other companies, other names. But always the same people behind them, hunting for what your great-great-grandfather and the other founders hid. Chapman moved to a locked cabinet in the corner, retrieving a leather portfolio that looked as old as the journal Jackson carried. "I'm the last one, you know. The last of the record keepers. We thought they'd given up, that the secret would finally die with our generation. But then the land purchases started again, more aggressive than ever." Opening the portfolio, Chapman revealed detailed diagrams and notes, all relating to the vault's construction and its intricate locking mechanism. But it was more than just technical drawings. The portfolio contained what appeared to be a warning, written in several languages. What lies within must remain sealed until the time of greatest need. To open it prematurely risks everything. The Sentinel guards both destruction and salvation. Which it becomes depends on the wisdom of those who find it. As Jackson studied the diagrams, things began clicking into place. The symbols weren't just decorative or even a simple code. They were part of an elaborate mathematical equation. The key lies in the alignment of stars when first blood was shed on sacred ground wasn't poetic language. It was a literal reference to astronomical positions. During the Civil War, your great-great-grandfather was the leader, Chapman explained, carefully turning pages of delicate documents. James Reynolds fought at Gettysburg before coming west. What he witnessed there, what many of them witnessed, changed them forever. When they discovered what was buried in this land, they understood its significance immediately. The diagrams showed that the vault was far more sophisticated than Jackson had imagined, a multi-chambered structure with a complex locking system that required specific components to be aligned in precise sequence. The cylinders he'd found were only part of the mechanism. The vault can only be opened when specific celestial bodies align in the exact configuration they held during the Battle of Gettysburg, Chapman continued, pointing to astronomical calculations in the margins. The founders believed this would happen only once every 160 years, a safeguard to ensure the vault remained sealed until the right moment. Checking a modern astronomical app on his phone, Jackson's excitement grew. The alignment described in the documents would occur in less than 3 days, precisely at dawn, on April 20th. This explained Hartland's sudden urgency. They must have decoded enough of the information to know their window of opportunity was approaching. What exactly is in there? Jackson asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment his plow struck metal. Chapman's expression grew somber. The documents don't say explicitly. The founders were careful never to commit the full truth to paper, but there are references to the element and the seed of both destruction and rebirth. Whatever it is, they believed it could either doom humanity or save it, depending on who controlled it and when it was revealed. Taking out Earl's metal cylinder, Jackson examined it more carefully. What he'd initially taken for random etchings was actually a star chart, showing the exact configuration needed. When he pressed certain points on the chart, parts of the cylinder shifted and moved, revealing intricate internal mechanisms. These aren't just keys, he realized aloud. They're calculators designed to confirm the proper celestial alignment for opening the vault. As he made these discoveries, Jackson heard vehicles on the road outside. Through the window, he could see headlights turning onto Chapman's long driveway. They were searching systematically, and the Chapman farm would be an obvious location to check. "They're here," Chapman said, remarkably calm. "We knew this day would come eventually. That's why we made preparations." He moved quickly to a bookshelf, pulling a specific volume that triggered a mechanism, revealing a hidden door in the wall. "This leads to the old root cellar, and then to an underground passage. It will take you to the north end of your property, away from the main house and field." "You're not coming?" Jackson asked, gathering the documents and cylinders. Chapman shook his head. "I'm too old for crawling through tunnels. Besides, someone needs to keep them occupied." He pressed a third metal cylinder into Jackson's hand. "This is the final piece. It was entrusted to my family. Together with what you already have, it should be enough." The sound of car doors slamming spurred Jackson into action. "What do I do once I open it?" "Trust your judgment," Chapman said simply. "The founders believed the vault would be found when the world needed its contents most. Perhaps that time is now." He closed the hidden door just as knocks sounded at the outbuilding entrance. The underground passage was narrow and damp, clearly not used for decades. Jackson's military training kicked in as he navigated the darkness, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The passage twisted and turned, occasionally rising close enough to the surface that he could hear vehicles and voices above ground. After what felt like hours, but was probably just over 45 minutes, Jackson emerged into an abandoned silo on the far northern edge of his property. Well away from the vault site and main house, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a sky brilliantly clear and filled with stars. Checking his phone, he found multiple missed calls from Marcus and a text reading, "They're searching everywhere for you. Whatever you found, it's big. Satellite images show they've got people at all roads in and out of the county." Jackson had roughly 60 hours until the celestial alignment. 60 hours to make it back to the vault site, decode the final mechanism, and open it before Heartland's people found him. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. Finding a secluded spot in a small grove of cottonwoods, Jackson laid out all the documents and began systematically analyzing them. The diagrams from Chapman's portfolio showed the complete internal structure of the vault. Not just a single chamber, but a series of rooms, each with different purposes. The central chamber contained whatever the element was, surrounded by smaller chambers filled with what appeared to be research materials and documentation. The most intriguing detail was a reference to James Reynolds' field notes, which supposedly contained the full truth about the vault's contents. According to Chapman's records, these notes had been hidden somewhere on the Reynolds property, separate from both the journal and the vault itself, a final failsafe in case the wrong people found the vault. Dawn was breaking by the time Jackson finished reviewing the materials. He needed to find those field notes, but he also needed to avoid Heartland's search teams, which were undoubtedly scouring his property. Moving only during daylight would be too risky. He would have to wait until nightfall to continue his search. Settling into a well-concealed position, Jackson allowed himself a few hours of the tactical rest he'd mastered during long missions. Not deep sleep, but enough to maintain functional awareness. As dusk approached, he carefully made his way toward the farmhouse, using natural cover and the techniques that had kept him alive in hostile territory. The scene that greeted him was worse than he'd imagined. Heartland had set up a full operation, center on his property, trailers, equipment and security personnel surrounding the vault site. Powerful floodlights illuminated the field as teams of workers expanded the excavation he'd begun. They had already exposed the entire circular plate and were attempting to decipher the locking mechanism. From his vantage point in a drainage ditch, Jackson could see men in suits consulting with what appeared to be scientists or engineers. They had sophisticated equipment scanning the vault door, but from their frustrated gestures, it was clear they hadn't yet figured out how to open it. Still, with their resources, it seemed like only a matter of time. His house was equally concerning, lights blazing in every room as people methodically searched through his belongings. They were looking for exactly what he carried in his rucksack, plus the field notes he still needed to find. Moving silently around the perimeter of his property, Jackson considered his options. The field notes had to be somewhere significant. To James, somewhere that would have seemed natural to check regularly without arousing suspicion. Where would a Civil War veteran and homesteader hide his most important secret? The answer came to him suddenly. The family cemetery. A small plot of land at the western edge of the property where generations of Reynolds had been laid to rest, including James himself. It would be the perfect hiding place, sacred ground that family members would visit regularly, but outsiders would have no reason to disturb. Making his way to the cemetery required crossing an open field. Jackson waited for clouds to obscure the moon, then moved in short bursts, freezing in place whenever vehicles passed on the nearby road. After 20 tense minutes, he reached the small, fenced enclosure containing a dozen weathered headstones. James Reynolds' grave was marked by a simple stone bearing his name, military rank, and the dates 1839 to 1912. Nothing unusual was visible, but Jackson had learned enough about his great-great-grandfather to know the man wouldn't have made it easy. Examining the headstone more carefully in the dim light, he noticed subtle irregularities in the carved regiment designation, certain letters deeper than others, forming a pattern similar to the vault symbols. Pressing these points in sequence, caused a small section at the base of the headstone to slide open, revealing a hollow space containing a metal box, green with age, but still intact. Inside was a leather-bound book, its pages yellow but preserved, filled with James Reynolds' precise handwriting and detailed diagrams. The field notes were comprehensive, detailing how James and 6 other Civil War veterans had discovered the element while digging a well in 1867. The substance, which James described as not of this earth, had unique properties unlike anything known to science at that time. When exposed to certain energies, it could transmute matter, heal grievous wounds, or release destructive force beyond anything they'd witnessed even on the battlefields of Gettysburg. The veterans, all educated men despite their farming occupations, recognized both the potential benefits and catastrophic dangers. They conducted careful experiments, documented their findings, and reached a unanimous conclusion. The world of 1867 was not ready for such power. The terrible wounds of the Civil War were still fresh, and they feared what nations might do with such technology. So they constructed the vault, using their combined knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and astronomy to create a time lock that would keep the element secured until humanity had either advanced enough to use it wisely or faced a crisis that necessitated its use despite the risks. The final pages contained technical instructions for safely handling the element once the vault was opened, along with James's personal reflection. We who have seen war's greatest horrors chose to bury this power, not to prevent its use forever, but to ensure it emerges in an age that understands the responsibility it brings. May whoever reads these words in that distant future be worthy of the trust we have placed in them. The enormity of this responsibility settled on Jackson's shoulders like a physical weight. The element could revolutionize energy production, medicine, even space travel if James's observations were accurate, but it could also create weapons beyond imagination if controlled by the wrong people. People like whoever was behind Hartland's search. A noise from the direction of the farmhouse snapped Jackson back to his immediate situation. Flashlight beams swept across the fields. The search teams were expanding their perimeter. He needed to move quickly. According to the field notes, the vault required all 3 cylinders, plus a specific mathematical calculation based on the current celestial positions to unlock. James had designed it this way to ensure that even if someone found the vault and the keys, they would still need the knowledge contained in his notes to open it correctly. Jackson knew he couldn't outrun or outfight Hartland's security teams. His only advantage was his specific knowledge and the element of surprise. He needed a plan that would allow him to reach the vault during the celestial alignment without being captured. The field notes mentioned an emergency access tunnel that James and the others had built as a precaution, a narrow passage leading directly to the vault chamber from a starting point half a mile away. The entrance was hidden inside an old well that had long since been covered over, but if Jackson could locate it, he might have a way to reach the vault undetected. Dawn was approaching as Jackson made his way to the approximate location described in the notes. What had once been an operating well was now just a slight depression in the ground near the border between his property and the Blackburn farm. Years of plowing had obscured most evidence of its existence, but the dimensions matched. The description in James's notes, using his hands and a small folding shovel from his rucksack, Jackson began carefully digging. After removing about 3 feet of soil, his fingers struck wood. the old well cover preserved by the moisture-resistant cedar James had specified. Clearing enough space to access it, Jackson found the hidden release mechanism exactly where the notes indicated. The well cover slid aside with surprising ease, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. Iron rungs embedded in the wall provided a ladder down to what appeared to be a horizontal tunnel. After ensuring no one was nearby to observe, Jackson descended into the passage, carefully replacing the cover above him. The tunnel was extremely narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and in some places Jackson had to remove his rucksack and push it ahead of him. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting some kind of passive ventilation system had been incorporated into the design. James's engineering skills continued to impress, even after more than a century. The passage extended in a straight line for what felt like several hundred yards before Jackson encountered a brick wall blocking further progress. For a moment, he feared the tunnel had collapsed, but closer inspection revealed another hidden mechanism. Applying pressure to specific bricks in the pattern noted in James's field book caused the wall to pivot, revealing the final section of tunnel. After another 100 yards of difficult crawling, the passage ended at a vertical shaft with iron rungs leading upward. According to the field notes, this would place him directly beneath the vault's main chamber, bypassing the primary entrance entirely. The founders had created this route as a last resort, in case they needed to access the element quickly during crisis or emergency. Emerging into the bottom level of the vault, Jackson found himself in a small antechamber. The space was perfectly preserved, without a speck of dust or any sign of deterioration. The walls were lined with the same symbols he'd seen on the exterior plate, but here they glowed faintly with an inner light that illuminated the chamber in a soft blue glow. 3. Recesses in the wall matched the shapes of the cylinders he carried. Following the instructions in the field notes, Jackson carefully inserted each one in a specific order and orientation. As the final cylinder locked into place, a low humming filled the chamber, and a portion of the ceiling retracted to reveal another chamber above, the main vault. Jackson climbed the short ladder into the heart of the structure. What he found there left him breathless, just as the opening hook of this story had promised. The central chamber was a perfect sphere, its walls covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move as he watched. In the center, suspended, in what appeared to be a field of energy rather than a physical container, floated a small, crystalline object, no larger than a baseball. The element glowed with an inner light that shifted through colors Jackson had no names for. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, creating an odd sensation of connection. Around the sphere, workstations held scientific instruments far more advanced than should have existed in the 1860s, along with journals documenting the founders' experiments. One station held a letter addressed simply to the finder. It was written in James Reynolds' hand. "If you are reading this, the stars have aligned as we calculated, and the time has come. What you see before you is not of this world. We believe it arrived on the meteor that native legends say fell to Earth centuries before white settlement. Its properties defy the science of our time, but we have learned enough to know both its promise and its peril. The element responds to conscious intention and amplifies energy. In our experiments, we discovered it could heal mortal wounds, transmute base elements, and generate power without fuel. But we also found its destructive potential when approached. with fear or aggression. In the wrong hands, it could bring ruin beyond imagining. We who returned from war's horror chose to protect humanity from powers it was not ready to wield. If you have found this chamber, you face a choice we cannot make for you. The element can be removed safely using the containment device at the North Station, or it can be returned to its dormant state for another cycle by activating the mechanism at the South Station. Choose wisely, Finder. The world has changed since our time, but human nature remains constant in its capacity for both wonder and destruction. May your judgment be sound. The profound implications of this discovery washed over Jackson in waves. This wasn't just about saving his farm or outmaneuvering Heartland. The element represented a turning point for humanity, limitless clean energy, medical miracles, perhaps even the stars themselves within reach. But the same power could create weapons that would make nuclear arsenals look like children's toys. Outside, he could hear the faint sounds of machinery as Heartland's teams continued their attempts to breach the main vault entrance. They were running out of time. The celestial alignment would occur in less than 24 hours. Jackson needed to decide what to do with his discovery before they broke through. Jackson looked carefully at the two stations James had mentioned. The North Station contained what appeared to be a lead-lined container with elaborate mechanical seals, clearly designed to safely transport the element. The South Station housed a complex arrangement of mirrors and prisms that, according to the adjacent notes, would channel the energy from the element back into itself, returning it to a dormant state until the next astronomical alignment 160 years in the future. The choice before him was monumental. Take the element and reveal it to the world, with all the benefits and risks that would bring, or reset the vault and allow future generations to make the decision when the time came again. Jackson wondered if his great-great-grandfather had anticipated this moment. Wondered if he had somehow known that a descendant would stand in this chamber facing this exact dilemma. Moving to the research stations, Jackson began carefully reviewing the journals and notes left by the founders. Their experiments had been methodical and thorough, documenting both miraculous results and terrifying failures. They had discovered that the element responded differently depending on the intent and character of the person handling it. In the presence of selfless purpose, it produced wonders. When approached with greed or fear, the results were catastrophic. One journal entry particularly caught his attention, an experiment where James had used a small fragment of the element to restore fertility to a barren field. The crop yield had increased tenfold, and the soil remained exceptionally productive for years afterward without additional fertilizer. Another entry detailed how a mortally wounded man had been healed by mere proximity to the element, his injuries closing before the astonished observer's eyes. But there were darker accounts as well. A founder with a violent temper had approached the element while agitated, causing a reaction that nearly collapsed the chamber. Another experiment aimed at creating a more efficient steam engine had produced an explosion that left a crater 20 feet across. The founders had quickly realized that the element amplified not just physical energy, but human intention, making the character of its possessor as important as their technical knowledge. As Jackson absorbed these accounts, he heard a muffled explosion from above. Heartland's team was becoming more aggressive in their attempts to breach the vault. He had perhaps hours before they broke through, assuming they didn't inadvertently trigger one of the founders' defensive mechanisms in the process. Moving to a workstation containing maps and survey documents, Jackson discovered something unexpected: detailed plans for an extensive network of underground waterways and fertile areas, all connected to the location of the vault. The founders had chosen this specific site because geological surveys indicated it sat at the nexus of several underground aquifers. The element's energy had been subtly influencing the surrounding land for generations, explaining why the Reynolds farm and neighboring properties had remained productive even during the worst drought years. This revelation gave Jackson pause. The element had already been providing a measured benefit to the region for over a century, carefully contained, yet still influential. The founders' wisdom suddenly seemed even more profound. They had found a balanced approach that allowed the element to help without risking its misuse. Another explosion, closer this time, sent dust falling from the ceiling. Heartland was getting nearer. Jackson needed to make his decision. Sitting at the central workstation, he reviewed everything once more. The element could potentially solve the world's energy crisis, end hunger, and revolutionize medicine. But it could also create unprecedented weapons and, if monopolized by a corporation like Heartland or whatever entity stood behind them, lead to a level of power consolidation that would fundamentally undermine democracy itself. His military training had taught him to evaluate risk and reward, to make difficult decisions under pressure. The founders had created this time-lock mechanism for a reason. They believed humanity needed time to develop the wisdom to match such power. Had enough time passed? Was the world of 2023 significantly wiser than the world of 1867? The answer came to him as he reviewed Heartland's increasingly aggressive tactics. Their willingness to use surveillance, intimidation, and now explosives to access the vault suggested that at least some powerful forces in the modern world were no more trustworthy than those the founders had feared. If the element fell into Heartland's hands, it would almost certainly be exploited for profit and power rather than the common good. Yet simply resealing the vault felt like abdicating responsibility. The founders had left this decision to whoever found the vault during the alignment, trusting that person's judgment. They could have created a mechanism that automatically resealed itself, but instead they left a choice. As Jackson contemplated his options, his eyes fell on James's field notes again. The final pages contained technical specifications he hadn't fully processed earlier, detailed instructions for a third option the letter hadn't mentioned. The founders had created a way to release a small, carefully calibrated portion of the element's energy while keeping the main source secured. This controlled release would spread the beneficial properties throughout the region without the catastrophic risks of removing the element entirely. This middle path resonated with Jackson. It honored the founder's caution while still allowing some of the element's benefits to help address current challenges. According to the notes, the released energy would gradually enhance soil fertility, purify water sources, and even have subtle healing effects on living organisms in the area. The influence would be greatest near the vault, but would extend in a radius of approximately 50 miles, enough to revitalize the struggling farming community without drawing undue attention. The process required precise calibration, using components from both the north and south stations. Jackson worked quickly, following James's instructions to the letter. As he assembled the mechanism, another explosion rocked the chamber. Heartland was nearly through. When the device was ready, Jackson positioned it at the focal point indicated in the notes and activated the sequence. A beam of light, shifting through impossible colors, extended from the element to the device. The chamber filled with a soft humming as energy flowed through the carefully arranged conduits. According to James' notes, the process would take approximately 20 minutes to complete, distributing the energy before automatically resealing the vault for another cycle. The sound of metal grinding against metal from the chamber above told Jackson that Heartland had reached the outer door of the vault. He needed to disappear before they broke through completely, but he couldn't leave until the energy distribution was complete. The emergency tunnel that had brought him here would be his escape route, but first he had one more task to complete. Using his tactical camera, Jackson methodically documented the chamber, the research stations, and the founders' journals, not the technical specifications that could be misused, but the philosophical underpinnings and cautionary accounts that explained why they had chosen to seal away such power. This record would serve as evidence of what had happened here, and if necessary, a warning for future generations. As the energy distribution neared completion, Jackson gathered his great-great-grandfather's field notes and the most crucial journals. He couldn't risk leaving these for Heartland to find. The sound of voices now joined the mechanical noises from above. They were almost through. The device gave a soft chime, indicating the energy distribution was complete. The element at the center of the chamber began to pulse more slowly as the resealing mechanism activated automatically. According to James's notes, the vault would now be impenetrable for another 160 years, regardless of what technology was brought to bear on it. Taking one last look at the chamber that had remained hidden for over a century, Jackson descended into the emergency tunnel, sealing the access point behind him. He had just entered the narrowest section when the sounds of Heartland breaking through to the main chamber echoed down the passage. Crawling as quickly as possible, Jackson made his way back to the well entrance. By the time he emerged, dawn was breaking. In the distance, he could see additional vehicles arriving at his farmhouse. Heartland was bringing in reinforcements, likely in response to breaching the vault, only to find it already resealed. Making his way through drainage ditches and wooded areas, Jackson eventually reached Earl Blackburn's property. The old farmer was waiting on his back porch, shotgun still in hand, looking as though he hadn't slept all night. "You did it, didn't you?" Earl asked simply, seeing something in Jackson's expression. "It's done," Jackson confirmed. "The vault is resealed, but the benefits will still reach the community. The founders thought of everything." Earl nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "Your great-great-grandfather was a wise man. So were they all. They understood that some powers aren't meant to be controlled by any single person or group." He gestured toward his fields. "Already looks different, doesn't it? More alive somehow." Jackson followed Earl's gaze, and indeed there seemed to be a subtle vibrancy to the landscape that hadn't been there before. The morning light caught dew, drops that sparkled with unusual brilliance, and the spring crops appeared to stand taller, their green more intense. "Heartland won't stop looking," Jackson said. "They broke into the vault, but they'll want to know how it was opened and who did it." "Let them look," Earl replied with a dismissive wave. "They can dig until doomsday. That vault won't open again, until the stars say so. As for you, I think it's time you disappeared for a while. Martha's brother runs a farm co-op up in Minnesota. They could use someone with your background, both military and agricultural, and leave the Reynolds farm. After everything," Earl smiled knowingly, "the farm will be here when it's safe to return. In the meantime, we'll make sure Heartland doesn't get their hands on it." Trust me, after what you've done, every original family in this county will stand together. We protect our own. Later that day, as Jackson prepared to leave, news began spreading through the county. Farmers were reporting extraordinary germination rates in recently planted fields. Wells that had been running low were suddenly flowing at full capacity. Even more remarkably, Earl's wife Martha, who had been battling arthritis for years, found she could move without pain for the first time in decades. No one connected these changes to the vault or to Jackson specifically, but word spread quickly of a miracle spring unlike any in living memory. Heartland's security personnel were suddenly faced with an influx of local farmers, news reporters, and environmental scientists, all curious about the unusual phenomena happening throughout the county. Before departing, Jackson visited David Chapman one last time, returning some of the historical documents, but keeping his great-great-grandfather's field notes secure in his rucksack. The elderly historian seemed years younger, his formerly stooped posture noticeably straighter. "The energy is healing the land and its people," Chapman observed, "just as the founders intended, limited, distributed, beneficial without being revolutionary, enough to attract the wrong kind of attention." "What about Heartland?" Jackson asked. "They won't just give up." Chapman smiled cryptically. "I may have anonymously sent some carefully selected historical documents to several major news organizations and environmental groups. Documents suggesting Heartland's aggressive land acquisition in the county might be related to illegal disposal of industrial chemicals from their parent company's manufacturing divisions. By this time tomorrow, they'll be so busy dealing with EPA investigations and public relations nightmares, they won't have resources to spare for chasing myths about secret vaults." Jackson couldn't help but laugh. The old historian had outmaneuvered a multi-billion-dollar corporation using nothing but carefully deployed information, a fitting contribution from the county's record keeper. As Jackson drove north that evening, following back roads to avoid attention, he reflected on the choice he'd made. The element would remain safely sealed until humanity was truly ready for its power, if that day ever came. But its influence would still help heal the land and community his ancestors had cherished. His phone chimed with a message from Marcus. "Whatever you did, it worked. Satellite imagery shows Heartland pulling personnel out of the county. Environmental investigators arriving instead. You safe?" "Safe and heading to new ground," Jackson replied. "Will explain when I see you. Some stories are better told in person." Through his rearview mirror, Jackson could see the golden light of sunset illuminating his fields one last time before they disappeared from view. The land looked different now, vibrant in a way he couldn't quite explain, but instinctively understood. The element's energy was already at work, rejuvenating soil that had been steadily depleted by decades of modern farming techniques. The small farms that had been struggling against corporate takeover would find themselves mysteriously more productive in the coming seasons. Wells would remain full despite drought conditions. Crops would resist disease without excessive pesticides. None of these changes would be dramatic enough to attract scientific scrutiny, but collectively they would allow the county's family farms to thrive again, just as they had when the founders first settled this land. In his pocket, Jackson carried a small vial of soil from his field, a reminder of his heritage and the trust that had been passed down through generations. Someday, when it was safe, he would return. Until then, The Reynolds farm and its secret would be protected by the community that had always known there was something special about this land, even if they hadn't known exactly what. The vault's energy would continue its subtle work, distributing healing and renewal across the countryside. And somewhere, Jackson believed, his great-great-grandfather and the other founders were at peace, knowing their creation continued to serve its purpose, protecting humanity from power it wasn't ready to control, while still providing the benefits that came from living in harmony with these extraordinary forces. As Nebraska fell away behind him, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had been entrusted with a momentous decision and had found a middle path that honored both progress and caution. The element would remain safely contained, but its blessings would flow freely, helping not just his land, but all the struggling farms in the county. In the end, the most valuable discovery hadn't been the element itself, but the wisdom of those who had protected it, the understanding that some powers aren't meant to be wielded directly, but rather to be stewarded carefully. For the benefit of all, it was a lesson as relevant in 2023 as it had been in 1867, and one that Jackson would carry forward as the newest guardian of a legacy more precious than any material treasure. The vault beneath the Reynolds farm would remain a secret, its full potential locked away until a distant future when the stars aligned once more. By then, perhaps humanity would have earned the right to wield such power responsibly. Until that day, the land would continue to whisper its secrets to those who listened closely, those who understood that true wealth came not from controlling nature's gifts, but from living in balance with them. And so Jackson Reynolds, former soldier and reluctant farmer, became something his ancestors would have recognized immediately, a steward of the land and its mysteries, continuing a tradition that stretched back to the founders who had first recognized that some discoveries changed everything, especially when handled with the wisdom to know when to use them and when to let them rest, guarded by the silent sentinel beneath the Nebraska soil. 2 years later, Jackson Reynolds stood in a sunlit field, watching as farmhands harvested the most abundant corn crop the Minnesota Cooperative had seen in decades. His expertise, a unique blend of military precision and the farming knowledge he'd absorbed since inheriting his family land, had proven invaluable to the operation. The transition hadn't been easy, but he'd found a new purpose here: helping. Small farmers band together to compete with the corporate giants steadily consuming America's heartland. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a text from Earl Blackburn. "Time to come home. Things have changed." The message was characteristically brief, but its implications were enormous. For 2 years, Jackson had maintained a low profile, connecting with Earl only through encrypted messages and occasional calls from burner phones. The elderly farmer had become his eyes and ears in Nebraska, keeping watch over the Reynolds property and monitoring Heartland's activities. According to Earl's updates, the aftermath of the vault's energy distribution had been remarkable, but subtle enough not to attract unwanted attention. Crop yields throughout the county had increased by 30% without changes in farming practices. Water quality had improved dramatically, with formerly contaminated wells testing clean for the first time in decades. Most surprisingly, the county's health statistics showed a marked decrease in cancer rates and autoimmune disorders. Heartland's aggressive expansion had faltered in the face of unexpected resistance. The environmental investigations Chapman had triggered revealed genuine improprieties in the corporation's waste disposal practices at other facilities. The resulting fines and regulatory scrutiny had forced them to abandon their efforts in the county temporarily. More importantly, the farms they'd been targeting were suddenly thriving, giving owners reasons to hold on to their land despite generous offers. Jackson had followed these developments from afar, taking satisfaction in the knowledge that his decision had benefited the community while keeping the element's true nature secret. Still, he'd never expected to return so soon. Something significant must have happened for Earl to break their communication protocol. 3 days later, Jackson crossed the Nebraska state line in a battered pickup truck purchased with cash. He'd changed his appearance, growing a full beard and letting his military short hair lengthen into a ponytail. Few would recognize the man who had fled the county 2 years earlier. Earl met him at a roadside diner 30 miles outside the county. The old farmer looked remarkably healthy, his formerly arthritic hands now steady as he pushed a manila envelope across the table. "Heartland's gone," Earl announced without preamble. "Filed for bankruptcy 4 months ago after the EPA investigations expanded to their other holdings. Their assets were acquired by various companies, including the land they bought in our county." Jackson opened the envelope to find property records and legal documents. "Who bought them out locally?" Earl's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "We did. The Blackburns, the Chapmans, and 8 other original families formed a land trust. We've been quietly reacquiring the properties Heartland snapped up, including the Reynolds farm." Jackson stared at the documents in disbelief. His family's land had been purchased by the trust after the bank foreclosed. According to the paperwork, the trust was willing to transfer ownership back to him for a nominal fee. "How did you manage this?" Jackson asked, stunned by the scope of what the families had accomplished. "The improved crop yields gave us capital we haven't had in generations," Earl explained. "But more importantly, we had a shared purpose. The vault's energy didn't just heal the land. It reminded us of what our ancestors built together." He pushed another document forward. "There's something else you should see." It was a geological survey report commissioned by the State Water Authority. The findings were remarkable. The county's groundwater aquifer, which had been depleting for decades, was now recharging at unprecedented rates. Scientists were baffled by the phenomenon, attributing it to unique subsurface geological structures they couldn't fully explain. "They've been swarming the county with research teams," Earl continued. "Universities, government agencies, environmental groups, all trying to understand what makes our water system so resilient. They're calling it a potential model for sustainable aquifer management nationwide." "Have they found anything concerning?" Jackson asked, thinking of the vault. Earl shook his head. "Nothing specific. The changes are consistent across the county, with no obvious epicenter that would point to the vault. Most experts think it's just a natural hydrological cycle we don't fully understand yet." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But David Chapman had a stroke 6 months ago. Before he passed, he gave me something for you." From his jacket pocket, Earl produced a small leather pouch. Inside was a brass key, unlike any Jackson had seen before, along with a handwritten note in Chapman's shaky handwriting. "For the Guardian, when the time comes again, the ancestor knowledge is waiting." Jackson examined the key carefully. It didn't match any of the mechanisms he'd seen in the vault, yet something about its design seemed familiar, reminiscent of the intricate workmanship in the founder's creations. "Chapman never told any of us what this opens," Earl said. "But he was clear it was meant for you specifically. His last words were, 'Reynolds will know when it's needed.'" The following morning, Jackson returned to his family farm for the first time in 2 years. The land looked vibrant and healthy, fields lush with growth, the old oak trees greener and fuller than he remembered. Even the farmhouse appeared rejuvenated somehow, its weathered boards retaining their character but seeming stronger, more resilient. Martha Blackburn had maintained the interior in his absence, keeping it clean and functional. Everything was much as he'd left it, with one significant exception. A new door had been installed in the cellar, replacing the simple wooden one that had been there for generations. This door was steel, with a sophisticated electronic keypad. Beside it, Earl installed it, Martha explained when she handed over the keys. Said the cellar needed better security, what with all the researchers poking around the county. The code is your military service number. After Martha left, Jackson entered the code. The door opened to reveal the familiar cellar space, but with more. An addition. A reinforced concrete wall had been constructed at the back, concealing about a third of the original area. A small brass keyhole was embedded in the center of the wall, perfectly sized for Chapman's key. The lock turned smoothly, triggering a mechanism that caused a section of the wall to slide aside. Behind it was a small room lined with metal shelving, containing dozens of leather-bound volumes, similar to his great-great-grandfather's journal. A workstation dominated the center, featuring what appeared to be modern computer equipment integrated with components Jackson didn't recognize. Technology that seemed simultaneously advanced and antiquated. A letter in a sealed envelope lay on the workstation, addressed simply to the Reynolds Guardian. The handwriting matched David Chapman's. "If you're reading this," the letter began, "I've passed on, and the trust has returned you to your rightful place. What you discovered beneath. Your field was only part of the founder's legacy. The element they contained was their most dangerous discovery, but far from their only one. The founders were more than simple farmers. They were scientists, engineers, and visionaries who recognized that their discoveries were too advanced for their time. The vault was their most crucial project, but this archive represents the culmination of their less dangerous but equally revolutionary knowledge. Your great-great-grandfather led the group they called the Seven Sentinels. After Gettysburg, these men found common purpose in ensuring that science would serve humanity's highest ideals rather than its darkest impulses. The element accelerated their research, allowing them insights that were generations ahead of their contemporaries. This archive contains their complete works: agricultural innovations, medical treatments, energy systems, and building techniques that could transform society without the catastrophic risks of the element itself. They preserved this knowledge, believing that someday the right person would appear to gradually introduce these advancements when humanity was ready for specific pieces. The computer system contains a complete digital archive, along with a decision framework to help determine which innovation should be released and when. I've maintained and updated it throughout my life, as did my father and grandfather before me. You, Jackson Reynolds, have been chosen twice now, first by your great-great-grandfather through your inheritance, and then by your own actions at the vault. The Seven Sentinels believe that true guardianship isn't about hoarding power, but knowing when and how to share it wisely. The trust of families has safeguarded this knowledge for generations. Now we entrust it to you. Use it wisely, reveal it carefully, and remember that progress without wisdom is merely another form of destruction. The letter was signed not just by David Chapman, but by representatives of all 7 original families, including Earl Blackburn. A postscript in Earl's handwriting added, "We knew you'd return when the time was right. The county needs a guardian. The old families are fading, and the knowledge requires new blood." For hours, Jackson explored the hidden archive, marveling at the scope of the founders' work. Their agricultural techniques went far beyond anything currently practiced, working with natural systems rather than against them. Their medical treatments utilized plant compounds and energy principles that modern pharmaceutical research was only beginning to explore. Their energy systems harnessed natural forces in ways that produced no pollution while providing abundant power. Most remarkable was the decision framework Chapman had mentioned, a sophisticated analytical system that considered hundreds of factors before recommending whether a specific innovation was ready for introduction to the wider world. The system evaluated everything from environmental impact to economic disruption to cultural readiness, ensuring that advancements would benefit humanity broadly, rather than concentrating power or creating unintended consequences. As night fell, Jackson sat at the workstation, running the decision framework's first analysis. The results suggested starting with the agricultural innovations, techniques that would allow farmers to produce more food with fewer chemical inputs while gradually healing damaged soil. Unlike the vault's energy distribution, which was automatic and regional, these techniques would require active implementation but could spread through normal channels of agricultural education and demonstration. Jackson realized this was exactly what he'd been prepared for throughout his life. His military training had taught him discipline, strategy, and the careful evaluation of risk. His farming experience had connected him to the land and its rhythms. Even his time at the Minnesota Cooperative had shown him how to introduce new methods to traditional farmers without triggering resistance to change. As dawn broke over the fields, Jackson made his decision. He would begin implementing the founders' agricultural techniques on the Reynolds farm, documenting the results and sharing the methods with neighboring farmers as rediscovered traditional approaches rather than revolutionary new science. This gradual introduction would allow the innovations to spread naturally without attracting the kind of attention that had led to Heartland's aggressive pursuit of the vault. Over the following months, Jackson transformed his farming operation. He planted cover crops using specific sequences described in the archive, incorporated companion planting designs that maximized soil health, and implemented water management systems that mimicked natural hydrology. The results were immediate and impressive. Plants grew stronger and more disease-resistant. Soil tests showed rapidly increasing organic matter, and water efficiency improved dramatically. Neighboring farmers noticed. Earl brought a delegation to inspect Jackson's methods, and soon several agreed to try similar approaches on portions of their land. The county agricultural extension agent visited repeatedly, baffled but impressed by results that defied conventional expectations. Universities requested permission to establish research plots, which Jackson allowed under carefully controlled conditions. What Jackson didn't share was the source of his knowledge or the existence of the archive. To the outside world, he was simply an innovative farmer rediscovering sustainable practices. Only Earl and the representatives of the original families knew the truth, and they supported his cautious approach completely. As autumn arrived, bringing with it the most abundant harvest in county memory, Jackson received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Cortez, a researcher from the Department of Agriculture's Sustainable Farming Initiative, arrived unannounced one afternoon. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her expression serious as they walked his fields, "I've been studying your farming methods for months now. The data we're collecting here and from satellite imagery doesn't align with any known agricultural practices." Jackson maintained his composure, offering the same explanation he'd given others, a combination of techniques learned from his ancestors and innovations developed through careful observation. "Here's the thing," Dr. Cortez continued, stopping to examine. "A cornstalk bearing 3 perfect ears, where conventional varieties produced only 1. I specialize in historical agricultural practices, particularly those that disappeared during the industrialization of farming. There's no record of anything approaching what you're doing here. Not in this region, not anywhere." She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "I think you know something you're not sharing, Mr. Reynolds, something that could help a lot of people in a world facing climate change and food insecurity." For a moment, Jackson considered maintaining his cover story, but something about Dr. Cortez's genuine concern gave him pause. The decision framework in the archive had indicated that agricultural innovations were ready for wider implementation, and spreading them would require trusted partners in the scientific community. "Walk with me to the North Field," he said finally. "There's something I'd like to show you." As they crested the small hill overlooking his property, Jackson pointed to the pattern of his fields, visible now from this elevation. The arrangement of crops, woodlots, and water features formed an intricate design that was only apparent from above. "This isn't random," he explained. "It's a system designed over 150 years ago by a group of farmers who understood something fundamental about working with nature rather than against it. They created an approach to agriculture that was so effective it seemed impossible to their contemporaries, so they kept it within their community, passing it down through generations." Dr. Cortez studied the landscape with new understanding. "A secret agricultural society, that's—" She hesitated. "Actually not as far-fetched as it sounds. There are historical precedents, especially among Civil War veterans who formed tight-knit communities." "I have their records," Jackson said carefully. "Detailed journals, experimental results, systematic observations across decades. I've been implementing their methods gradually, confirming that they work in today's context before sharing them more widely." "This could revolutionize sustainable agriculture," Dr. Cortez said, excitement evident in her voice. "Why keep it limited to 1 county?" Jackson considered his response carefully. "Because rushed implementation without proper understanding could lead to misapplication or corporate exploitation. These methods require a fundamental shift in how we think about farming, not as domination of the land, but as partnership with natural systems. I need trustworthy allies who understand this isn't just about techniques. It's about an entire philosophy of agriculture." By the time they returned to the farmhouse, Jackson had made his decision. Dr. Cortez would be his first contact beyond the county, the beginning of a carefully managed network that would gradually introduce the founders' agricultural innovations to the world. The decision framework had assessed her as an ideal candidate, scientifically rigorous yet open-minded, connected to implementation networks yet independent from corporate interests. That evening, as Dr. Cortez reviewed the first set of journals Jackson shared with her, he stood on his porch watching the sunset illuminate fields that seemed to glow with health and vitality. The vault remained sealed beneath his land, its raw power safely contained until a distant future generation might be ready for it. But the knowledge the founders had developed, wisdom gained through careful observation and respect for natural systems, was beginning its journey into the wider world. Jackson Reynolds, once a lost and struggling veteran, had found his purpose as guardian not of a secret to be hoarded, but of knowledge to be carefully shared. Like the crops he tended, this legacy would grow gradually, taking root in receptive minds and flourishing where conditions were right. Far beneath his feet, the element pulsed with its mysterious energy, continuing its subtle work of healing the land. And in the hidden archive, generations of wisdom waited to be rediscovered at the right moment by the right people, not as sudden revolution, but as thoughtful evolution toward a better relationship between humanity and the world that sustained. As winter settled over the Nebraska plains, Jackson and Dr. Cortez established a systematic approach to analyzing and documenting the founders' agricultural methods. The farmhouse's dining room became their research center, walls lined with charts tracking soil composition, microbial activity, and crop yields across different test plots. Elena had taken a sabbatical from her university position, relocating temporarily to a rental property in town to focus exclusively on what she now called the Reynolds restoration system. "These nitrogen fixation rates are unprecedented," she remarked one evening, reviewing soil samples from fields where Jackson had implemented the founders' companion planting techniques. "Modern cover cropping achieves maybe 30% of these results. The bacterial communities in your soil are incredibly diverse, more like old-growth forest systems than agricultural land." Jackson nodded, unsurprised but pleased by the scientific confirmation. The founders understood that soil isn't just a growing medium, it's a living ecosystem. Their journals describe it as the first crop that produces all others. Their work together had fallen into a productive rhythm. Jackson would implement techniques from the archive, Elena would document and analyze the results, and together they would translate the founders' sometimes archaic terminology into modern scientific language. This translation was crucial for their long-term plan, developing teaching materials that could spread these methods through existing agricultural education channels. Elena had proven herself trustworthy, never pressing for more information about the archive's origins than Jackson was willing to share. She accepted his carefully crafted narrative about inherited family journals, focusing instead on the validity and effectiveness of the methods themselves. Her scientific credibility would be essential when they eventually began publishing their findings. As they worked through the winter months, Jackson gradually revealed more of the founders' innovations. Beyond the basic companion planting and soil building techniques, he introduced Elena to more advanced concepts, water management systems that functioned like natural watersheds, pest control methods that utilized plant communication networks, and seasonal timing based on subtle environmental cues rather than fixed calendar dates. This isn't just sustainable agriculture, Elena observed after particularly striking results from their winter wheat test plots. It's regenerative. These methods don't just maintain soil health, they actively improve it year over year. If implemented broadly, they could potentially reverse decades of industrial farming damage. The potential was enormous, but so were the challenges of implementation. Modern farming was entrenched in practices that prioritized short-term yields over long-term soil health. Equipment, infrastructure, and financing were all optimized for chemical-intensive monoculture. Even farmers who recognized the benefits of more sustainable approaches often couldn't afford the transition period when yields might temporarily decrease before the soil ecosystem recovered. Jackson and Elena spent many late nights debating implementation strategies, their discussion sometimes continuing by the fireplace long after the research work had ended for the day. Their professional relationship had developed a personal dimension, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. The founders faced similar resistance, Jackson explained during one such conversation. That's why they practiced these methods quietly, expanding their influence through example rather than evangelism. People had to see the results in their neighbors' fields before they would consider changing their own practices. We don't have the luxury of that timescale anymore, Elena countered. Climate change, water scarcity, and soil degradation are accelerating. We need widespread adoption within a decade, not a century. She was right, of course. The world the founders had known moved at a different pace. Information spread slowly, allowing innovations to be thoroughly tested before wide implementation. The modern world's interconnectedness created both opportunity and risk. Ideas could spread globally almost instantly, but so could misapplications and unintended consequences. Their solution emerged gradually, a phased introduction beginning with a network of demonstration farms across different climate zones. They would select farmers known for innovation and independence, train them intensively in the founders' methods, and use their success to create ripple effects through agricultural communities. Universities and extension programs would document results, building an irrefutable case for the effectiveness of these approaches before attempting broader policy changes. This strategy aligned with the decision framework in the archive, which consistently recommended gradual, demonstrable implementation over dramatic revelations or mandated changes. The founders had understood a fundamental truth about human nature. People resist what is imposed, but embrace what they discover through their own experience. As spring approached, bringing the first opportunity to implement their plans beyond Jackson's farm, an unexpected complication arose. A convoy of vehicles bearing the logo of Verdant Agricultural Solutions arrived in the county. Verdant, one of the corporations that had acquired portions of Heartland's assets after its collapse, had maintained a low profile in the region until now. Earl brought the news during his weekly visit to review progress. "They're setting up some kind of research station on the old Thompson place," he reported, referring to a property adjacent to Jackson's northern boundary. "Brought in all kinds of equipment and scientists in fancy suits. They're telling folks they're studying soil microbiome enhancement or some such, offering good money to collect soil samples from neighboring farms." Jackson and Elena exchanged concerned glances. Soil microbiome research was precisely the field that would lead a corporation to notice the unique properties of land affected by the vault's energy distribution. "Have they approached you?" Elena asked Earl. "Tried to. Told them the Blackburns Haven't allowed outside testing of our soil since my grandfather caught a fertilizer company stealing samples in '52. Earl's weathered face creased in a grin. But they're persistent. Their lead scientist came by again yesterday, talking about unprecedented microbial diversity in satellite soil color analyses of the county. Said they'd pay triple their standard rate for access to my northeast field. This was concerning. Modern remote sensing technology could detect subtle differences in soil composition, plant health, and microbial activity, all factors that would be markedly different in land influenced by the vault's energy. We need to understand what they know and what they're looking for, Jackson decided. If they're just picking up on the agricultural methods we're implementing, that's one thing. But if they've somehow detected the vault's influence specifically, that's another problem entirely. That evening, after Earl departed, Jackson accessed the archive's security protocols. The founders had anticipated that their work might eventually attract unwanted attention and had developed systems for monitoring potential threats. One section of the archive contained sophisticated surveillance equipment that appeared modern, despite having been designed over a century ago. Using components from this collection, Jackson assembled small environmental monitoring devices that could be deployed around Verdant's research station. These sensors would collect data on their testing methods, equipment signatures, and research parameters without directly accessing their secure systems. Elena watched with growing amazement as Jackson constructed these devices with practiced efficiency. "This is military-grade surveillance technology," she observed. "Where did farmers from the 1860s get this kind of knowledge?" It was a question Jackson had been expecting eventually. His careful narrative about inherited farming journals couldn't explain the advanced technology in the archive. The time had come to trust Elena with at least part of the truth. "The founders weren't just farmers," he admitted, continuing his work on the devices. "They were scientists, engineers, and inventors whose military experience gave them access to advanced knowledge for their time. After the Civil War, they chose to apply that knowledge to agriculture rather than weapons development, believing that feeding people was a better legacy than finding new ways to kill them. It wasn't the complete truth about the element and its influence on their discoveries, but it was true enough to explain the archive's contents while maintaining the vault's secrecy." Elena considered this explanation. "Like a 19th century version of swords to plowshares," she said finally. "It makes sense historically. The Civil War drove significant technological advancement, and many inventors were involved in the conflict." Over the next week, Jackson discreetly placed the monitoring devices around the perimeter of Verdant's operation, using his military training to avoid detection. The data they collected was both fascinating and concerning. Verdant wasn't just studying soil microbiomes. They were specifically looking for unusual energy signatures and mineral compositions that couldn't be explained by normal geological processes. More worrying still, their team included individuals whose communications patterns suggested connections to government or military research divisions, not the usual associates for an agricultural corporation. They were mapping subsurface anomalies using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, creating a survey grid that was gradually approaching the section of Jackson's property containing the vault. "They're looking for something specific," Jackson concluded after reviewing a week's worth of data, not just investigating unusual soil properties, but searching for their source. How could they know about the vault? Elena asked, still unaware of its existence, but increasingly cognizant that Jackson's farm contained something beyond agricultural innovations. They probably don't know exactly what they're looking for, Jackson replied carefully. But corporations, like Verdant, have vast data resources. They might have detected energy anomalies in satellite imaging, unusual mineral concentrations in water samples, or patterns in crop yields that don't match standard agricultural models. These concerns were confirmed when Jackson's monitoring devices captured fragments of communication between Verdant's research director and their corporate headquarters. Anomaly consistent with theoretical predictions. Energy signature unlike anything in our database. Recommend expanding search parameters to adjacent properties, particularly the Reynolds farm, where satellite data shows highest concentration of unusual biological activity. The situation was escalating faster than Jackson had anticipated. If Verdant connected the unusual properties of the county's soil to a specific source on his property, their next step would certainly be attempted acquisition, either through financial offers or less legitimate means. The vault itself remained secure against any technology they possessed, but the scrutiny would make Jackson's work with the archive dangerously visible. After consulting with Earl and the representatives of the other founding families, Jackson developed a multi-layered response. First, the land trust that had reacquired properties from Heartland filed legal petitions challenging Verdant's research permits, citing potential environmental impacts and trespassing concerns. This wouldn't stop their investigation permanently, but would slow them down and force more transparent operation. Second, Jackson accelerated the implementation of the founders' agricultural methods on neighboring farms, creating a broader pattern of unusual soil health that would make his property less distinctively anomalous. If exceptional results appeared throughout the county, Verdant would have more difficulty isolating a specific source. Finally, and most crucially, Jackson decided to control the narrative by releasing certain information preemptively. Working with Eleanor, he prepared a research paper documenting the rediscovered historical farming techniques being implemented in the county, providing a plausible explanation for the unusual soil properties that Verdant had detected. "We're attributing everything to agricultural methods," Elena confirmed as they finalized the paper. "Nothing about energy signatures or mineral anomalies. We're giving them a reasonable scientific explanation that accounts for their observations without revealing the complete truth," Jackson clarified. "The methods we're documenting genuinely do improve soil health and microbial diversity. These improvements are accelerated by the vault's energy is information they don't need." Elena's expression suggested she recognized the gaps in this explanation, but she didn't press further. Their weeks of collaboration had built a foundation of trust, even with the understanding that Jackson maintained certain secrets. The paper was submitted to a respected agricultural journal under both their names, with Elena's academic credentials lending it immediate credibility. Simultaneously, they invited the County Agricultural Extension Office to organize a tour of participating farms for regional officials and academic researchers, creating public visibility for their work that would make covert corporate investigation more difficult. These measures created breathing room, but Jackson knew they were temporary solutions. Verdant's resources and determination suggested they wouldn't be easily dissuaded, especially if their research had military or energy sector connections. A more permanent resolution would require understanding exactly what they were seeking and why. Using the decision framework in the archive, Jackson evaluated options for more direct engagement with Verdant. The system processed all available information about the corporation, its research focus, and key personnel, eventually recommending a controlled revelation strategy, approaching Verdant's scientific team directly with selected information that would redirect their interest without exposing the vault. The opportunity came during the county farm tour, which Verdant's research director, Dr. Harriet Winters, attended after receiving the published paper. Jackson arranged to be her guide for the Reynolds farm portion of the tour, allowing time for private conversation as they walked the fields. "Your paper with Dr. Cortez was illuminating, Mr. Reynolds," Dr. Winters began, her tone professionally. Cordial, but with an underlying intensity Jackson recognized from his military days, the focus of someone with a mission. "Though I admit we've observed soil characteristics here that exceed what your documented methods should theoretically produce. The paper covers the foundational techniques," Jackson replied carefully. "There are additional factors specific to this region's geography and history that contribute to the results you're measuring." Dr. Winters' attention sharpened noticeably. "What factors specifically?" Jackson led her to the eastern field where the founders had installed a specialized water management system that utilized the natural contours of the land to distribute mineralized water from deep aquifers. This system, while impressive, was entirely agricultural in nature with no direct connection to the vault. The original settlers of this county were remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of hydrology, he explained, showing her the subtle berms and swales that directed water flow. They created subsurface irrigation channels that tap into mineral-rich aquifers hundreds of feet below the surface. These minerals create unique soil conditions that enhance microbial activity. This explanation was technically accurate while omitting the fact that the vault's energy had been gradually changing the composition of those minerals for over a century. The system Jackson demonstrated was genuinely innovative for 19th century engineering and would account for many of Verdant's readings without revealing the true source. Dr. Winters studied the water management system with evident fascination. This design resembles modern permaculture principles, but implemented well before that movement existed. Do you have the original engineering plans? Some components have been documented in family journals, Jackson acknowledged. I'd be willing to share those with your research team, provided the information remains in the public domain rather than becoming proprietary corporate technology. This offer represented a calculated risk. By providing Verdant with genuinely valuable agricultural innovations from the archive, Jackson hoped to redirect their interest from energy anomalies to water management systems. The specific documents he would share contained no references to the vault or the element, focusing entirely on the founders' legitimate agricultural engineering. Verdant would certainly consider an open-source collaboration, Dr. Winters replied, though something in her expression suggested this wasn't her decision to make. Our primary interest is understanding the unusual biological activity in this region's soil. These water management systems could explain a significant portion of our readings. By the tour's conclusion, Jackson had established a tentative professional relationship with Dr. Winters, positioning himself as a cooperative resource rather than an obstacle to their research. This approach recommended by the archive's decision. A framework would allow him to monitor their activities more effectively than direct opposition. That evening, as the tour group departed and quiet returned to the farm, Jackson found Elena waiting on the porch, her expression troubled. "You showed Dr. Winters the water management system, but not the other installations we've been documenting," she observed. "And you offered historical engineering documents I've never seen. There's more to this farm than you've shared with me, isn't there?" The question hung in the cool evening air. Jackson had known this moment would come eventually. Eleanor's scientific mind was too sharp, her observations too precise, to maintain partial truths indefinitely. The decision framework had recently adjusted its assessment of her trustworthiness, suggesting that limited disclosure about the archive itself, though not the vault, might now be appropriate. "There is more," he acknowledged, taking a seat beside her on the porch steps. "Much more than I've been able to share. The question isn't whether you can be trusted with this knowledge, Elena. It's whether knowing more puts you at risk from people who would exploit it without your ethical constraints." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "What I can tell you is that my ancestors and the other founding families preserved knowledge that was ahead of their time, creating systems to ensure it would emerge gradually when humanity was ready for specific portions. What we've been implementing is just the beginning, the agricultural applications of a much broader body of work." Elena processed this information silently, her scientific training evident in her methodical consideration before responding. "Is this why Verdant is really here? They've detected something beyond agricultural innovations." "Yes," Jackson confirmed, "and they're not the first organization to search for it. My family and the others have been protecting this knowledge for generations, releasing it selectively when it can benefit people without creating new forms of exploitation or destruction." As Elena and Jackson sat together on that porch, something shifted between them, a deepened trust born from shared purpose. She didn't need to know everything about the vault to understand the importance of their work. 5 years later, the Reynolds restoration system had spread to farms across 3 continents. The careful, phased introduction Jackson had planned proved remarkably effective. Verdant eventually shifted from investigation to collaboration, with Dr. Winters becoming an unexpected ally after witnessing the undeniable results. The vault remained, safely sealed, its energy continuing its subtle work of healing the land, while Jackson selectively shared innovations from the archive that humanity was ready to embrace. The founder's vision was being fulfilled not through revolutionary disclosure, but through thoughtful evolution. On a warm autumn evening, Jackson stood in his fields, watching the sunset paint the horizon in brilliant oranges and purples. Elena joined him, their hands naturally intertwining, partners now in both work and life. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud," she said softly. "You found the perfect balance between protection and revelation." Jackson nodded, watching combines harvest in the distance. The true treasure was never the element itself, but the wisdom to know when and how to share knowledge that can change everything. In the farmhouse, their young daughter was adding her own observations to the journals that would someday become her responsibility, continuing the legacy of guardianship into another generation. The secret beneath the Nebraska soil remained protected, not as power to be hoarded, but as potential to be released when truly needed, the ultimate insurance policy for humanity's future. Thank you for joining us for A Farmer's Plow Reveals a Secret Vault Beneath His Land. If you enjoyed this journey of discovery and ancient wisdom, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that blend history, mystery, and inspiration. Hit that notification bell to never miss our weekly tales of ordinary people encountering extraordinary discoveries. Until next time, remember that the greatest treasures often lie hidden just beneath the surface of our everyday lives.